WPHAT. You're listening to the #1 health and wellness podcast, the place where health and consciousness connect. Perfectly healthy and toned radio with your host, Darren McDuffie. And now, prepare to get fat. Yo, what's up, peeps? Darren McDuffie here, alias Fat Man, helping you become perfectly healthy and toned and conscious, of course. And this episode is being brought to you by perfectlyhealthyandtoned.com. Make sure you go and check it out. Today's episode is 168 with Julia Ross, entitled The Craving Cure. Before I talk more about Julia Ross's book, The Craving Cure, I wanted to remind you of a previous episode, as I always do, episode 167 with Heather K. Jacobson, entitled Going Gluten-Free. If you are someone that's out there that has not found out that gluten can cause specific health problems, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to this episode. I know for me, my own personal experience with gluten was that when I eliminated it from my diet, my arthritic knees were suddenly better, and also it helped me stabilize my weight. So again, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. I'm not saying it's going to be the miracle cure-all for all, but I've seen some positive results from many people when they extract gluten from their diets. Now, let's get into episode 168, Craving Cure with Julia Ross. Julia's been on the show before, specifically on the Mood Cure. If you remember that show where we talk about nutritional therapy for things like depression and anxiety, and that show got a really positive response. And she has a new book now called The Craving Cure. And I don't know about you, but I know me, I've had my bouts with cravings. I've had all kinds of cravings throughout my life when I've tried to reduce my calories and shed body weight just so I can look aesthetically pleasing. So we get into why we have these cravings and what we can actually do about them on this show. And there's a lot of good information on this show. And I would tell you that if you have not gotten a chance to go out and get one of Julia's books, she has 3, I believe. One is called The Diet Cure, one is called The Mood Cure, and this last one is called The Craving Cure. And I can say that they work because I know that I've been trying these, especially for cravings. I get cravings in the afternoons when I'm at work, and I tend to go to the vending machine and grab some peanuts or something else. And I know that since I've been doing this nutritional therapy, I have not had those cravings. So I can tell you as a testament that this nutritional therapy does work. So now, enough of my blib-blabbing. Let's get on with the show, and let's get into Julia Ross's bio. Julia Ross is a world leader in the use of nutritional therapy for the treatment of mood problems, eating disorders, and addictions. After 10 years as a psychotherapist working with individual adults and adolescents, families, and groups in a variety of psychiatric and outpatient settings, Ross began to direct programs. Some of her early achievements included the founding of the San Francisco Bay Area's first programs for food addicts and for drug-addicted adolescents and their families. Coming up on episode 168, The Craving Cure with Julia Ross. Here's what you're going to learn. What happened in the 70s that changed our diets forever? A lot of things went on in the 70s, including me being born. But we talk about eating habits and what specifically changed with our eating in the 1970s. How is protein linked to the development of the human brain? Julia Ross is a proponent for animal protein, and we'll be talking about that specifically in episode 168. Why is Alzheimer's a disease of glycation? If you don't know what the term glycation is, pay attention, because Julia gives an excellent definition of glycation and why it's important to know this when it comes to Alzheimer's and also diabetes. What is neuromarketing? Man, this is a term I had never heard of. And I know there are a lot of you out there who are listening to the podcast who may have not heard of the term neuromarketing as well. But Julia does give a great definition of neuromarketing and why you need to be informed. Why do we have cravings? What are the types of cravings? I share my experience of craving because yes, I do have cravings, and I even tell about my craving types on this episode. Now, let's get into episode 168. Enjoy. Julia Ross, welcome back to Perfectly Healthy and Toned Radio.
Well, I'm glad to be with you again.
I'm glad you are back. I've got your new book, The Craving Cure. I have lots of questions for you. But before
as usual,
yeah. But before we get into getting into those questions, I wanted you to give us a brief synopsis of your health journey.
Well, I have been pretty healthy. I come from a physically healthy family, mentally healthy too. Not always likable, but so I would say the most important thing that has happened to me in relation to what we need to talk about today is that in the 1970s, I went to work in the addiction treatment field, which was just beginning then, because addiction was starting to overgrow, and we were getting problems in numbers that we'd never had to deal with before. And so I had the pleasure of inventing marvelous techniques for treating addiction. However, by 1980, the problem had expanded so rapidly that we were in the middle of a crack epidemic, and our formerly 50% successful methods were now garnering 0% success. We had 24-hour relapse 100% of the time. And so I went into a depression, which is something that I wasn't used to, but I knew what it was all about. It was that I had trained myself and devoted myself to a field and had just learned that everything I had learned and everything I contributed was useless in the face of the problem. And fortunately for me, a few years later, we got the answer to the problem. You know, what's going on here that the best counseling, the best spiritual approaches, the peer support, why doesn't any of it work? And the answer came from brain science. And what I learned from these scientists who specialized in the addictive brain is that cravings for substances, whether they're food substances or clearly drug substances, alcohol, tobacco, so forth, all operate and take control of us through 5 specific sites in the brain. That was so enlightening. It helped explain why our psychosocial, spiritual approach wasn't working. But fortunately, just a few years later, one of those scientists gave us a solution that we could actually implement in our programs, in which I've been working with ever since. He told us about 5 nutrients that fed those 5 appetite-regulating functions in the brain so that they would stop the addictive craving, so that all of that sensation, the negative moods that draw you to certain substances would go away. And so the actual visceral craving and need for that particular kind of pleasure. And so ever since then, my depression has been lifted. Ever since I found a solution, something that I could really work on and see quick results from. And so even though it was a pioneering effort and I didn't always get the appreciation that I would have liked the public to give to this so badly needed technology, it didn't matter, because sitting right across the desk from me was somebody who was suddenly smiling when all they could think about before to even get through the day was chocolate, or pasta or whatever that they knew, as pre-diabetics were killing them.
I wanted to get into talking a little bit about diabetics, but before we get into that, this is your 3rd book. You've had the Mood Cure, the Diet Cure, and now this is the Craving Cure. And to me, this book gets a little bit more in depth as to the history of what's really causing this whole mood swing and this depression and all this other stuff. But you started out with the 70s, of these dietary changes coming around the 70s. And I'm a child of the 70s. I was born in the 70s, and I remember, as I was reading the book, I remember that my grandmother would only take us to McDonald's on special occasions. And now you have people who are eating McDonald's every single day, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, all these fast food things and microwave meals. But take us back to the 70s and kind of go through what happened to change us to where we are today in 2019.
Well, if we go back just for a minute, the 2 million years prior to the 1970s, a lot of people don't know this, but anybody your age or younger would not know that for all that time we had virtually no degenerative disease. In other words, we had infections, we had viruses and plagues and so forth, and women died in childbirth, but those were really the only reason for premature death, other than famine. So weight was not a problem. Health was not a problem. Neither problem really existed. And I've got photos of human society right up through the 60s showing lovely confidence in our bodies and no reason not to have it, and our health. But in the 1970s, we were convinced that the increase, the degenerative disease that started all of this, in the 70s, we became convinced that heart disease, which had been growing since the 1930s, was really derived from our diet, and that the dietary problem causing heart disease had to do with fat, and that if we eliminated as much fat as possible, particularly fats that contained cholesterol, which isn't a fat, by the way, and is vitally important to the brain and hormonal system, for example, that we would turn the heart disease epidemic right around and send it back where it came from. What we know now is that that was a mistake, that there was a big battle between the anti-fat people and the anti-sugar people, and the anti-fat people lost. The anti-fat people won. The sugar people had a bigger budget than the dairy farmers, whose whole milk sales cut in half, more than in half, and have never rebounded, for example. So our first mistake was to vilify saturated fat, which we had been thriving on for 2 million years at normal weights and optimal health. So that was the first thing. So we eliminated the good fats. We did substitute damaged and highly processed fats, so we didn't even lose calories there. We just switched to modern, damaged, highly processed fats, which have a lot of adverse health consequences, including inflammation, which is a whole part of a natural weight gain. So what did we do in addition to that? Probably even more important, we introduced free fructose into our food supply. We'd never had free fructose before. Table sugar, sucrose, which is the sugar that was invented in India about 500 BC, is a combination of fructose and glucose bound together in a 50-50 ratio. Very, very unusual plant. And we were able to tolerate increasing amounts of that without weight gain or without much degenerative disease. Not to say that in the 50s, when we started eating 120 pounds a year of it, that was a good thing. We know that it contributed to the heart disease epidemic significantly, but it did not contribute to the diabetes epidemic. There was no diabetes until the 1970s. That's when it started to bound forward, and by the 1990s, we had a full-on epidemic in the United States, and it was traveling rapidly throughout the world. And fructose, the type of sugar that we've been eating since the 1970s, is more than twice as sweet as the old-fashioned table sugar, and much more addictive.
This is the high fructose corn syrup that you're talking about.
That's right.
High fructose. Okay.
So corn syrup, agave syrup, and fruit syrup, they're all very, very high in free fructose, which the body just doesn't know what to do with that amount of free fructose that isn't bound with glucose. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I could talk the whole time about fructose, but that was probably the most significant thing that happened in the 70s. However, when you combine it with losing our traditional fats, it's a disaster. And then really we only have one macronutrient left because people stopped eating protein as well, because protein is, all the amino acids in protein are always bound up with fats. So in order to get rid of all animal fats, they had to basically get rid of all animal protein as well. So the other, and probably the most significant of all foods in terms of the development of the human brain and why it's 3 times larger than the brain of other primates, that we began to eat a lot of red meat, which was low fat. You know, these were animals that were running all the time. So it was the amino acids that were so critical. But we tolerated animal fat very, very well as it increased over time, you know, as we began to use herd animals instead of hunting wild animals so much and so forth. So at that point, we couldn't eat protein, we couldn't eat fat, so we were left with carbohydrate. And the kinds of carbohydrates that began to be popularized at that time were deadly. You know, we're talking about carb loading on almost completely nutrient void pastas and sweets, white flour products, and a variety of mixtures of sugars. And of course chocolate and so forth that add to the addictiveness of processed and commercial foods. So those are the main things that happened. So as a result, our carbohydrate intake tripled, our protein intake was cut in by 2/3, and of course our fat intake actually changed very little, but the quality of our fats drastically changed. This is the kind of food that we began to eat would have been unrecognizable to someone from any time before 1930, really.
Yeah. It just seems like today I was looking on Instagram, and I'm friends with Chris Kresser. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Chris or
Sure.
not, but Chris posted a new study that came out, and they were again vilifying meat, vilifying animal protein. What are your thoughts on that? You work with different people, and you've seen the outcome of, I'm pretty sure you mentioned in your book that you work with vegans and vegetarians, and you've always been this proponent for meat. And why do we seem to, in the society, attack meat all the time?
Well, it started with this, with this fear of fat, because you just can't have meat without fat. You can have dairy products without fat, which a lot of people have done, involuntarily, I might add. Low-fat dairy is really terrible, as far as I'm concerned. But that was the beginning. And then we began to be acquainted with the whole vegetarian spiritual arguments, and then the ethical arguments, and the reality of the suffering of the animals because of industrial animal farming. So all of these things combined. The truth is, though, that there are very few vegans in the world. There are certainly not very many who don't eat meat. 50% of vegans worldwide, who are Buddhists typically, eat meat. The Dalai Lama eats meat. And the Buddha himself was not a vegan. Buddha ate dairy products and eggs, and he was very fond of honey. So all of these sort of mistaken but exciting to us. America is a country that gets excited about a new diet. It's been like this for over 100 years. I don't know when we became so sort of hysterical about finding a new diet when we already had foods that were supporting our health and beauty. What more do you need? But we decided we needed a diet that supported our spiritual life too, which is a very lovely concept, except that there are very few people in the world who have done it. And for example, the vegetarians in India are notoriously low in iron, for example, which is a vital nutrient. They have high rates of anemia, even among children. So these are experimental diets with no research behind them. We have just launched into these radical ways of eating in the spirit of adventure and revolution and progress, but without the evidence to support it.
I want to go back to the brain, because your book reminded me of something that I knew, but sometimes you forget these things, and when you read them, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. But the brain takes up the most glucose in the body. It takes a lot for the brain, glucose for the brain to run. But you talk about something in this book that I haven't seen a lot of. And really, the last time I talked about it, I think it was I had a show about gluten, and it was advanced glycated end products. But you also talk about how that process happens, what produces that process, and that's glycation. But can you go into glycation and just talk about what that is and why that's so important when it comes to dealing with glucose and sugar and the techno carbs?
Well, it's one of the startling things is how few people know that it exists. They don't know what it is. They've never heard the term before. And so it's terribly important that people get very familiar intellectually with what's happening to them without their being knowledgeable. One of the, let's talk about what it is. It's actually a kind of damage that all the cells of the body are vulnerable to. And there are two sort of perpetrators here that do this cellular damage. One of them has been known for many, many years, and that's the kind of damage that's done by toasted foods.
Mm-hmm.
And there are various names for it, but most of us have been familiar with this concept that burnt, toasted, overly browned foods actually do damage. They create injury to our cells broadly. But that was tolerable. We had toast every morning, but we didn't have the degenerative diseases that glycation is so central to until fairly recently, and it really until fructose, free fructose, unbound with glucose, was introduced, because free fructose is more than 10 times more glycating than any other form of sugar. So, and the body doesn't know what to do with it, so it gets a free ride. Glucose can be limited by ancient body systems that know when we've had enough, but fructose can't be. It actually turns off some of the appetite guardians of the body, and so it can flood the bloodstream unregulated, and that means that it travels all over the place and damages cells wherever it goes, in the brain, in the liver, in the bloodstream itself. As a matter of fact, the disease that's most associated with glycation is diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that people measure their vulnerability to diabetes is by a blood test that measures glycated hemoglobin, actually blood cells in the bloodstream that have been damaged by fructose or by the Browning syndrome, which is toasted foods, but mostly by fructose. And if your level of glycated cells is high, you are diabetic. If they are moderately high, you are pre-diabetic. So all of the degenerative diseases, particularly diabetes, are intimately associated with glycation. And we're not going to get rid of them until we can stop eating glycating substances, and that means fructose. The glycation experts are clear that if we weren't eating fructose, we could have barbecue and toast and whatever, but we can't have both. And so we've got to stop the cravings for this highly addictive substance that's destroying us.
What's going on in our brains? Before I get into that, but I had another question with regards to all this glucose. Are we getting too much in the brain? Because they actually are saying that Alzheimer's, which seems to be affecting, I've had several family members with Alzheimer's and dementia, and it seems to be that they're saying that they're really listing Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. It's just because we're getting so much influx of these techno carbs in the body that suddenly it's just the brain is getting overloaded with just too much glucose.
Yes, Alzheimer's is very clearly a disease of glycation. So again, fructose is not glucose, but fructose is really the problem. The body knows how to protect itself against glucose, but not against fructose. And fructose is just more glycating than glucose. Glucose doesn't damage in the same way. But in terms of blood sugar in the brain has a particular disability. It's vulnerable because it can't and doesn't store glucose the way the rest of the body does. We've got glucose stores all over the place in the body and all of our muscles and so forth, but the brain doesn't have that. So it is completely reliant on a supply of glucose, a regular, constant supply of glucose.
Mm-hmm.
But our blood sugar is so dysregulated that we can't keep the supply going, and levels can drop, and the brain sends out emergency calls, and we start eating sweet things. But it also can't function normally and produce the kinds of appetite-regulating neurotransmitters that it can do when its function is consistent and, full on.
Mm-hmm. Fructose, we're talking about this, and every time I hear about fructose, I'm always thinking about fruit, but you're talking about fructose, and I think we made this distinction earlier on in the interview. But from your book, you said that fructose affects some hormones, and I believe that was leptin and ghrelin.
Ghrelin.
Can't
And
ever
insulin.
pronounce, and insulin. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that's important for the audience to know what those hormones do and how fructose affects those hormones.
Well, let's take insulin, for example. Insulin levels rise when we've ingested too much glucose, and that removes the excess glucose from the bloodstream. That's a regulatory lifesaver. When it's overdone, which it's being, because we're eating, too much glucose, it turns into, diabetes. It's the main avenue to diabetes. But when fructose is ingested, the body doesn't know what's going on. The glucose mechanism does not change. And so the fructose is allowed this free ride into the bloodstream for tremendously wide circulation. So that's one mechanism. Leptin and ghrelin are also, they are more appetite regulators. And whereas excess glucose turns the regulatory hormones on so that they send a signal to the body, that's it. We're satisfied, we don't need any more food. But fructose does the reverse. It keeps them turned off so that we never really are satisfied. We can always be eating more snacks. And that's pretty much what we're doing, is snacking from morning till night.
You have people out here who are eating, I've seen videos of people say they eat umpteen bananas a day. And I know that we're talking about high fructose corn. So is fruit a different matter altogether, or is fruit thrown in that same category?
No, it's not in the same category. Fruit is very different. Fruits vary a lot in their sugar content. Most of them are a combination of plain glucose, a bound combination of fructose with glucose, and some free fructose. So there's plenty of glucose, there's plenty of bound fructose, but there's not very much in proportion of free fructose. There's always some, but we've always thought of fructose as the safe sugar. And that's really because it doesn't raise insulin. We just were mistaken. We didn't understand that wasn't a good thing.
You mentioned in the book your thing is Techno Carbs, which is for carbohydrates. It seems like the 70s, like you said, changed everything. Was this just because we didn't know enough? Or do you think, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but do you think that it's because this was all by design to start this cascade of illness so people could be sick and people could be obese? And now that that's come about, the master plan is out there, and now it's time for people to kind of say, hey, this is what's going on, and now I know I need to kind of eat better foods.
Well, I can answer, I'd like to define Techno Carbs, first of all, which are the modern masterpieces of food science. They are 60% nutrient void. They're certainly mostly devoid of any healthful carbohydrates, fats, or protein. And they are targeted. They're specifically targeted by the food industry and what they call bliss point technology to affect the 5 areas of the brain that create sensations of pleasure and activate and overactivate those centers. So there's something called neuromarketing, which is bound up with the food industry's efforts over the last 40, 50 years to create substances that we will be unable to resist. There was a very important whistleblower, David Kessler, the former head of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, who made friends with all the CEOs of the drug companies and of the big food companies. And he wrote a book after he left the agency, and in it he quoted food industry leaders repeatedly, saying, it's really too bad that the ingredients that have made these foods so irresistible and so lucrative have also made them so deadly. And he also made it clear that they had no intention of changing that. So I think that, in the 70s and 80s, when the brain chemistry of appetite became, elucidated, and they saw what was needed in order to make a substance irresistible and make the brain vulnerable to that substance. So it needed it for a temporary surge of pleasure. That was, a business decision. And they feel, really triumphant that they have been able to market these products so cleverly, but more than that, that the products themselves are such clever, brain-targeted pharmaceuticals. And as I say in the book, dressed up like adorable little, things called Twinkie and,
Mm-hmm.
Dorito.
Yeah, actually, I had a gentleman on, Mark. I can't remember Mark's last name. It's a crazy name, but I can't remember. But he had a book called The Dorito Effect when all this stuff started happening with the Doritos. And so it's always good to hear this stuff from someone else, because a lot of times people think it's all conspiracy theory, but it's people that are actually sitting behind the scenes engineering this food to be addictive. And once you start eating it, you can't get off of it. I remember I used to be a Taco Bell freak, and I don't even eat. I haven't been in a McDonald's or Burger King or Taco Bell in I don't know how long. I just made a decision to stop it, but I could have sworn there's certain things I was addicted to, and I was addicted to gluten as well. And I got gluten out of my diet. I know I'm gluten sensitive, but I would sit there and eat like, the whole roll of cookies, like the Oreo cookies. I would eat a whole 2 sleeves of those. Because I was, even though it was bad for me, I couldn't stop. I could not stop. But let's go into these. You mentioned these 5 centers of the brain, and I guess this is just going to be a refresher as, the mood cure, but there are people out there who might have not listened to that interview. But what are those 5 neurotransmitters?
Okay, let me just say one thing before I go into it, and that is that in the Craving Cure, I talk about the research specifically on chocolate chip cookies and M&Ms, showing which of these brain centers is being affected. There's research showing which of these 5 pleasure centers in the brain are being lit up by even advertisements for these kinds of foods, which is how the marketing works, so that the marketing images themselves start the addictive process going in the brain. So, by the way, David Kessler's book, forgot to mention, is called The End of Overeating. It's well worth a read. It really is. He did us a great favor by exposing the food industry, which he was clearly reluctant to do, but he himself had been suffering from overweight since childhood. And he couldn't keep this information to himself. At any rate, on to exactly where the crime is being committed. It's in the brain, which does control our appetite, and it interacts with hormones like insulin, ghrelin, and leptin. But these 5 centers are clearly the primary players here in appetite regulation. So I'll start with the neurotransmitter, the specialized cell in the brain that emits a substance called endorphin, which is pretty well known as our natural painkiller, our natural euphoriant, joy producer. So we're perfectly capable, the brain's perfectly capable of making endless amounts of endorphin if it's well supplied with protein and not too terribly stressed or poisoned. But when it's exposed to foods that target endorphin, like anything with chocolate, for example, but most of the foods that are combined together in these commercial products do impact the endorphins. So the part of the brain that should be making us feel comforted and happy, joyous really, is not producing the natural endorphins. And instead, we have to rely on a drug substance to overstimulate an underfunctioning cell so that what few endorphins there are forced into activity for a while, and overactivity. In the long run, that depletes them further, and we become more dependent on these external sources of pleasure. Temporary pleasure. We always have to go back because of the cravings that are produced when we don't. So then comfort food eaters are deficient in endorphin. But then we have the people who eat because they're depressed, anxious, and negative, worried. They don't sleep well. These are people who mostly crave in the afternoon and evening, which is when our brain produces less of its natural antidepressant, serotonin.
Is that the depressed craver?
That's the depressed craver.
Okay, I'm that.
hear that.
But I want to interrupt you because I had a bit of an issue with depressed because I feel like I'm never depressed. But the way that you describe some of the things in the book, like being anxious, I think one thing might have been like kind of hyperactive. I've always been hyperactive.
Yes.
And there were a few other things that I could agree on, but I'm like, I'm never depressed. But go ahead. We'll get into my stuff a little bit later here. But go ahead.
Well, from what you told me earlier, it's going to be good news. So stick with us. Okay. So the next one is the low blood sugar craving, another big group of hypoglycemics who tend to skip meals or eat snacks which are out of the bloodstream too fast to sustain level blood sugar. Those people also have repercussions to the brain that leads to cravings. So when you eat something sweet, for example, blood sugar spikes. Then insulin comes in to take it out, and then there's nothing. And that's a dangerous state to be in, especially for the brain. But, when we're in that state, we crave sugar and starch so that we can refuel and get those blood sugar levels up again. We also feel stressed, irritable, maybe even shaky. People who have that low blood sugar tendency pretty much know who they are. And there's a solution, simple nutritional solution to that we'll get to, that doesn't involve eating a lot of sugar and starch. So then we're to our fourth, which is our Natural Tranquilizer. When we're stressed, about 70% of us turn to junk foods to ease that, because they have the capacity of affecting the cells in the brain. In this case, it's called GABA, which would ordinarily be making lots of tranquilizing neurotransmitters, but in our current depleted state often isn't, and especially under the amount of stress that we're under of all kinds. And so we become dependent on foods that can give us a short surge of GABA and tend to snack on them whenever stress levels go up, instead of the big solid meal that would actually restore the brain to normal function. We've given up 3 meals a day decades ago. And finally, the last pleasure center in the brain that's so important, which is serviced artificially by caffeine and chocolate, but also by pure sugar for some people, is our energizing brain center, which produces neurotransmitters like dopamine. A lot of people know about that, which is a big factor in pleasure, but norepinephrine too, which allows us to feel energized and focused. It has a great deal to do with our ability to concentrate. So all of these marvelous things that our brain can naturally produce, energy, tranquility, joy, evenness, all of that, happiness, freedom from fear, all of that marvelous stuff, all of those neurotransmitters are depleted to a certain extent in almost everyone. And our only recourse is to use drug substances that will directly affect those particular brain sites. So we could use cocaine, we could use alcohol, tobacco, and we can also now rely on packaged foods that are designed to do just that and forget about the nourishment.
You said also, I believe this is the first of your books that you mentioned cannabis or marijuana, and that was one of the things that I believe it affected.
It's the newest addition.
Yes.
To the brain-targeted food industry. Well, I do talk about it in the addiction chapter in the Mood Cure, but I have a section in the book that takes each of the components of this brain-targeted industrial food process and explains what part of the brain it stimulates. So, for example, you talk about gluten. Well, we're eating more gluten than ever since the 1970s, when a new form of gluten was developed and began to be used worldwide. And that gluten itself has a second name, which gives you a clue about what part of the brain gluten affects. It's also called gluteomorphin. So morphine, it targets our natural painkillers, the endorphins. And that's why it can become so irresistible, particularly when it's combined with chocolate, which also heavily targets the endorphins. And then again, we have our dairy lovers, who it's all about ice cream, frozen yogurt, cheese, and of course the pizza lovers, who are probably in the greatest number, that combine the gluten with casein, which is one of the proteins, one of the major proteins in dairy products, and it also has an alternative name, which is casomorphin. So for some people, and I'm one of those people, the protein, and I have to say the fat, which fat can also and always does raise endorphin levels, not to the extent that chocolate does, not to the extent that cannabis does, or alcohol, or any of the other drugs, but it's just a natural feature of fat. We have to have it, and the fact that we like it ensures that we will eat it. But we don't necessarily overeat fat, and we didn't overeat fat for the most part until the 1970s.
Yeah, we're talking about all these products, the ice cream and the breads and things of that nature. It makes me think about weight. And one of the things you discussed in your book is calories and how calories, it just seems like no one can really agree on calories. Like, should we be eating 2,500 calories a day? Should we be eating 1,800? Should we be eating 800? I've seen people drop calories as low as 500 calories a day. When we're dropping our calories, does this bring on those cravings?
Absolutely. The rebound cravings after low-calorie diets are, reliable. They are always increased. And we learned a huge lesson. This is one of the areas that we have researched least, is our sort of obsession since the 1970s, when our weight began to rise, with low-calorie dieting. Nobody ever bothered to research that. Well, it's a fascinating story, actually. There was one researcher who did. He did a 6-month study on healthy college-age men. He put them on about 1,200 calorie diet, and they all became totally neurotic, craving-riddled, obsessed with food. Of course, they lost weight, which they didn't need to lose, muscle mass in particular. And ironically, this man, who documented in 3 volumes The Biology of Human Starvation, was written by Ancel Keys, who's also clearly the architect of our low-fat obsession. So he knew what he was doing when he recommended this huge calorie adjustment to the human diet. So about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, there was a big story that was first released in the New York Times. Gina Colada, our great diet reporter, sticking with this nightmare course all this time, told us yet another frightening story. The winners of the Biggest Loser competition had finally, there was some research done on them. Their blood was drawn when they first were accepted in the competition, and then again 6 years later. This is a good length of time, and what they report subjectively is that their cravings are over the moon, that they got much worse. And you can imagine they were really obese to begin with. Their cravings were very severe then, they're much worse now. And their weight has spiraled out of control, even though in a lot of cases they're certainly not eating more than they did to begin with, and yet their weight has gone higher than when they started the competition in a lot of cases. So what they learned from this, it was really simple. They didn't do any elaborate, no genetic testing, no really elaborate blood testing, but what the testing did show was that a number of metabolic appetite regulating factors like thyroid hormone were depleted and had never returned to normal. So let's take thyroid hormone, which regulates calorie burning. So it always drops with a low-calorie diet, but, we would hope that it comes back, and it typically does come back to normal so that we can regulate our weight. But with these people, it did not. It has never returned to the level that it was before they started this particular radical diet. And by the way, no one is saying how many calories they ate, so that the research is really useless in a way. We know that whatever they did harmed them permanently, but what we don't know is how low did they get. They were supposed to be eating a 1,500 calorie diet, but all of their trainers told them to go under that. so that we know that at least some of the time, we're eating as few as 500 calories a day.
One end of the spectrum, you have people that are biggest loser who have had issues with their weight. Most of them have had issues with weight probably all of their lives or a period of their lives. Then you have the other, quote unquote, what I will call healthy people, which are the bodybuilders and the fitness competitors. You've worked with those people as well. I believe in the book you said that someone attended one of your seminars and they were working with a bodybuilder and they had some success with this immunotherapy with regards to cravings. And one of the things I've seen with a lot of these bodybuilders is that when they're in season or in competition, they are in peak shape. And then when they're not, you hardly even recognize them. But talk about that and how you've had some success with helping these people with just these common cravings for food, because I think we all get them when we start dropping our I know I've experienced it myself, and I'm not even a bodybuilder, and I've had some issues where I've tried to drop calories, and I'm like, every time I see pizza or something like that, it's like, I can't, it's like crack to me because I can't, I can't seem to shake it out. Yeah, I want to eat it. So
yeah. And what that translates to is that you're starving yourself and you need to eat something, maybe not that. So what I can tell you is that before we've done a lot of work with, the clients of personal trainers who sent them in to us. Their trainers have sent them to us because they couldn't comply with, the diet that the trainer had recommended to them, which was oftentimes, very good quality food and oftentimes adequate amounts, but they just couldn't do it. Vegetables and protein, even with additional fat, they just couldn't do it. And so we were always able to turn off the cravings, and that allowed them then to go back to their trainer and stick with it and, become, fit, meet their goal. So the word got around, and eventually this fellow who consulted in the bodybuilding industry ended up taking a weekend training that I did and came up to me afterwards and told me that he had been reading the Diet Cure and the Mood Cure, and that he was brought in as a consultant on a number of high-level competitors to consult on with a number of high-level competitors. And he told me about one in particular who had like the best definition in the world. He was able to develop muscle. And partly because he was a good protein eater, but he just was gifted, obviously, his physique. But he couldn't stay away from the carbs. Could not. And so he never had top wins because he just couldn't stay away from them long enough to keep that definition obvious. Until this consultant worked with him, put him on the aminos, and all of a sudden he didn't care about the carbs. And he started to win. This same consultant took me to meet with the top management of a big bodybuilding products company. And they told me this is the black hole in bodybuilding. Nobody knows what to do. They can't give them the kind of advice that will help. They're always failing in this one thing. And they were, completely on board with the possibility that this amino acid technology, brain feeding technology could solve that problem. So it startled me because the bodybuilding industry is not just competitors, millions of people who love the whole bodybuilding thing and just for fun and for vanity, of course. But everywhere they're running into this problem that they can't solve.
One of the things that attracts me to this is the fact that, to me, it's very affordable. When you're looking at different things, it's going to the doctor and doing all these different diet programs. Right. Just doing the aminos is very affordable. I mean, I had some 5-HTP here that I've had for a while since talking to you about the Mood Cure that I forgot about. But I don't think that I paid maybe $9-10 and it has 240 pills or so. Mm-hmm. So it's not something that's going to break the bank, and it really attracts me to be able to have these things that are so affordable and to cut these cravings, which most people, when they have these cravings, they're going out buying cookies and bread and all.
Spending much more than $9. That's for sure.
More than $9. But one of the things I've always thought, I don't know if you're going to agree with me or disagree with me, but I thought I'd ask this, is that I always thought that maybe for anyone that's coming in with a weight issue or just someone regular off the street, if I was a nutritionist or anyone else, my two baseline things would be using this immunotherapy, because I think everybody at some point is depleted in serotonin and all the other neurotransmitters. And also, you and I met through something with the food sensitivity testing, which I think is a big thing for a lot of people, and they don't know that they're having these issues. My thing was gluten, and I always craved gluten. And when I took that out of my diet, I was able to normalize my weight. But do you agree with that as far as doing those things? I know that you're doing them within your clinic and helping others, but do you think that that should just be a baseline thing for people that are coming in that might have weight issues or having issues with foods that they're craving?
Well, certainly if they're craving a food that has no critical health benefits, like bread, that's got to go. If food or diabetes or, any number of health problems is at issue. But there's no point in laying down regulations like that, because if people crave, they don't have the control to lay off a food even when they know for sure that it's contributing to their weight and health problems. So what we do, and what I suggest Craving Cure, is to make a list of the foods that you crave, and you can put them in, categories of useless and toxic substances, and then things that have nutritional value but that you can't stop eating, like whole wheat, organic whole wheat products, or dairy products, particularly, grass-fed, organic, all kinds of nutrients in it. But if you can't stop eating it, it could be a problem. So you make a list of the things that you'd prefer not to be eating, and then you'd go to your own brain and figure out which pleasure centers you need to repair so that you'll be satisfied and pleased with what you eat without recourse to foods that you can't, whose consumption you can't control. So that's where we go, is first turn off the cravings and then look at elimination and challenge. So if you suspect that gluten's a problem, first turn off your cravings for it and eliminate it for a week, and then reintroduce it in a very clear way and see how you do. If it turns on those cravings again, you can't stop eating it and you don't need the calories, there's nothing about it that really is health critical, then it's got to stay off the list. Some people, once they get their neurotransmitter function organized, can tolerate a serving of something every now and then without becoming addicted to it and having too much of it. And other people can't, just like with alcohol. Some people with the aminos can have a glass of wine once a week and not think about it the rest of the time, or even care that much if they have it. Other people don't think much about it until they do have a glass of wine, and then they can't stop thinking about it. And for those people, complete abstinence has got to be the order of business. But with the aminos, you don't suffer. And one of the important things to say is that not only are they cheap, but they're temporary. As soon as you have stopped your cravings for junk food, you are going to be eating lots of protein, which contains all 20 amino acids. Animal protein does. And there you'll be supporting your own brain chemistry, and you won't need the additional supplements. Although I do recommend that, because you never know when a big stressor is going to hit you, illness, whatever, to keep your most important aminos in the refrigerator so that if you do need them, they're right there. Like you have your 5-HTP in the drawer. It's been waiting for you.
Going back to food and mood, and I wanted to ask you this during the mood cure. I always ask questions or think about questions after I get finished with the interview, but I'm going to ask you this question now, and it's kind of probably a loaded question, but how much does food affect our mood? And the second part of that question is going over working with people with these aminos, and I'm sure you probably work with people who were depressed. Were you able to get them off SSRIs? And I know that the aminos can work in combination with the SSRIs, but have you been able to eliminate people from, or help people from getting off these SSRIs by using this immunotherapy?
Well, when we first heard about SSRIs, I was outraged, because I knew that the aminos could do a better job. But then, we were buried in clients who were on them, and many of them had gained weight because of it, had lost their normal sex drive because of it, had, lost their normal vitality. They weren't depressed anymore, but they weren't enjoying life either, and many other side effects, which I document. There's a list in the book, but a longer list on the website, the Mood Cure website. So we worked out a way of just seamlessly taking people off of antidepressants, and I describe it. There's a whole chapter on alternatives to antidepressants, and it's basically a very simple maneuver. And as I say, we've seen hundreds and hundreds of people, and interestingly enough, we only had one prescriber object in all these years, because they're so used to people coming in and saying, I hate this SSRI, it's got this side effect or that side effect, and they try a different one. So they're used to withdrawing people from SSRIs. And so, but they're particularly happy to do that with our technique, because we actually have, with their permission, we have the client take the appropriate amino acid at the other end of the day from the end of the day where they're currently taking their antidepressant, so that they can see the effect of it. And if the effect is very good, which it invariably is, even though they're on an antidepressant, when they take this amino acid, they feel ever so much better. And if that lasts for 2 weeks, which it almost inevitably does, then they go to their doctor and say, okay, give me the withdrawal sheet. And they continue to take the amino at one end of the day and the antidepressant at the other, taper down the antidepressant, taper up the amino until they're done. And it could take a few weeks to a few months. And it's almost invariably very comfortable and uneventful. There are a few antidepressants that do cause some pretty terrible instant withdrawal problems. And in those cases, there's a bridge technique in which they switch from an antidepressant like Effexor or Wellbutrin to the antidepressant Prozac, and then taper down on that. So this is just a lovely process, very easy for a person to do on their own with the guidance of the Mood Cures chapter. But more and more nutritionists are getting trained in how to do this and support people through this process.
We're going a little bit over. I hope that's okay. I don't want to keep you too longer. But
well, it's okay with me, but I don't know how long you can keep broadcasting.
I can keep broadcasting, but I try to kind of cut the show just so people's attention span. But I just wanted to just say my testimonial about using this. I had forgotten about it. I'd interviewed you maybe a year ago, and I was on it pretty heavily, and I'd forgotten about it. And then reading the book, I was like, oh, you know what? I'm having these cravings at work. Like I would eat my lunch, and then I would have these cravings for candy. I would bring a brownie or something, a gluten-free brownie or something of that nature. The other day I tried it, and I noticed usually around 2 or 3 is when I start craving. And I eat around 12, and I tried the 5-HTP, and it's like 3, 4, 5, and I'm going home, and I'm like, wow, I didn't have that craving for any sweets today. And I noticed that. So it does work. And the thing about it is, like you say, you don't have to be on it the whole time. It's just something that you do and you're feeling better. And then if you are not, you can go back to it. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you just need a little boost, very briefly, and whether it's a couple of weeks, it would be typical. And then if your diet ramped up in the protein department, you typically don't need it. There are some people who have genetic problems with mood in particular, and they may need low-level supplementation for a long time. Particularly if there is addiction in the family, they'll need their aminos for at least a year. But that's unusual. And children, you can get them off the stuff in weeks and normalize their output and their appetites.
So I figured out from your questionnaire that I'm a depressed craver and a comfort craver. And then there was one that, and I can't remember which one it was, that you said that these people are these type of cravers are pretty much predisposed to being pre-diabetic or diabetic. Which one was that?
That was the crashed craver that tends to have the spikes of blood sugar followed by the crashes where you really crave.
And this particular, like if they do what you say in this book, those people can kind of reverse that or stop the damage that's already happened, is what I understand.
Oh, yes. It's just amazing. So, for example, diabetic. The nutritional information about diabetics is starting to come in. They're actually crudely deficient in 11 nutrients. And one of the top deficiencies is in the amino acid glutamine, which regulates blood sugar when glucose levels are not controllable. The glutamine can be used instead. And when we give glutamine to diabetics as well as people with low blood sugar, it's instant that their glucose levels normalize and their numbers go down into the normal range. There's been some nice studies showing that insulin resistance was reduced as well. It's a marvelous amino acid. It's like the medical golden child. There's so much research on glutamine and all the different positive contributions that it makes, but it's just becoming recognized, what a boon it is for blood sugar re-regulation.
Yeah, I know a lot of nutritionists recommend that for gut health, to repair the gut. Yeah, that's a really good thing. 2 more questions, and I'm gonna let you go. One, because we could do this for probably 3 hours, but
right.
You touched on something that I have not seen in many books, and I've always thought about this, and I think that we do this a lot of times here in where we are because we're all just kind of a melting pot. And you mentioned in the book about adopting a diet, like certain people will start trying to eat Asian food, and that's all that they want to decide to eat, but when they're not Asian, how does that affect us? And I think really that there's certain people who can't handle spicy foods. They might be able to handle spicy foods better, but I know that we have this tendency to do this in America because everybody comes from so many different places and we don't try each other's food. But there's this one of those things that might lend to cravings when we're eating out of our element, so to speak.
Well, yes. In the Craving Cure, I talk about some of the obvious things. So, for example, if you know what most of your ancestors, if most of your ancestors ate in a particular way, and you know what they ate, it is almost guaranteed that you're going to be very successful on that same diet. Mm-hmm. For example, everybody who's been primarily Oriental has done very well on rice, vegetable, and animal protein-based diets. They actually have, this is one of the fascinating things that Sally Fallon discovered, was that they've actually had a genetic adaptation to be able to digest rice, which most of us can't do that well.
Mm-hmm. I don't.
Okay, right.
Yes.
So that's one good example. The other thing, though, that's useful is that a lot of us just don't know what our ancestors ate. I mean, do you? I mean, what they thrived on.
I don't.
So I don't. So because I'm a big hodgepodge of genetic types. So, but what we can look at is our blood type. And of course, now there's more genetic information, which is very intriguing, and I think we'll know a lot more from it over time. But what we've learned primarily is about type O's and type A's, who make up most of the human population, and that type O's are really the ancient original blood type, and we've never seen, I think there's been one exception, a type O client who didn't need to avoid some of the more relatively modern foods like grains and beans, doing beautifully on the ancient foods, the roots, the berries, the greens, and animal protein. Often not so great on milk either. On the other hand, the A's, the other big group, don't have the health capacity of the O's, and that seems largely because they don't have such good hydrochloric acid production. So they often have difficulty with red meat, for example, and they think, I don't know what they think, but they don't ever do an HCl challenge, which we always do with type A's, because they digest protein much more efficiently when they have enough HCl. And an HCl deficiency is considered to be a factor in the higher rate of cancer among type A's. So there's a lot of reason to respect the limitations and the tendencies nutritionally that our blood types provide. We have seen so few types B and AB that we don't know what to make of them in terms of diet. But these are some of the things that we take into account. And we always go back to the fact that we're either, we know that we, for most of our history on the planet, did really well on various kinds of vegetables, fruits, and proteins and fats. However, for 10,000 years we've been herding animals and growing crops, and we have adapted until the 1970s it wasn't causing us any weight problems or disease problems to eat those foods. We may have lost people along the way when we were, changing the diet, but there was so much gratitude for having food even in the winter, when half the population would die, among hunters-gatherers, that it was worth the, whatever the downside was. So I think it's something we have to really look at when it comes to gluten and dairy intolerance, is that it may be more the modern alterations in the grains and the animals, the milk sources. For example, going to primarily Holstein milk was a radical change in the quality of our milk, and a lot of people can't tolerate it. But could those same people tolerate the earlier strains, of milk?
Actually, I got two more questions if you allow me. Because I wanted to get this one last question because I'm really intrigued by it, and I think I need to ask it. But you mentioned also in the book that sometimes a little goes a long way, and you mentioned that you work with people with this therapy and you didn't have to use as much aminos with them. And I think you specifically mentioned Native Americans and Africans as well. Talk a little bit about that, because I know there's somebody's going to be out there that's listening to the show and they're probably going to use it and realize that they have some kind of reaction. But I wanted you to talk about that because I know that's somebody's going to maybe experience that.
Okay. Well, let me say first that the Craving Cure is very particular to point out if there are any even remotely common adverse symptoms to an amino acid, so that people will know what they're getting into. For example, if they have high blood pressure, it's very clear that if you were going to experiment with the amino acid tyrosine, you start with a quarter of a capsule because it might raise your blood pressure. On the other hand, one whole capsule might do nothing to your blood pressure but get right to your brain and increase your natural stimulants so that you don't care about caffeine and chocolate anymore. So that said, the extraordinary thing that we have seen in working with lots of different people is that European Americans, there's some variation even among them, and a lot of times we don't know what we have. People maybe don't talk about the fact that they have African or Native American blood because nobody earlier on in the family wanted to admit it. But we've seen a tremendous amount of variation in the reaction to aminos only among Native American, and African Americans are sort of second in sensitivity and responsiveness. So this is a positive thing. Mm-hmm. In other words, a European American might need 4 capsules of a particular amino acid to get optimized, and then gradually they wouldn't need as much. They'd go down to nothing over the month. But a Native American would never need more than 1 capsule. And that would do just as much or more. And this was explained to me at a meeting where I was given an award by the tribal clinics of the state of California for my work with aminos among the various tribes and rancherias, reservations. And what they told me is that the reason that they're so responsive is that they have the hunter-gatherer digestive system. And that means that they consume, or they utilize every molecule that they consume extremely efficiently. So that if they get something that's positive, they're going to use every single bit of it, and it's going to be distributed perfectly within their brain and body. If they get something toxic, though, the same thing happens. They can't dodge the bullet, literally. The toxic properties hit them 4 times as hard. But as do the beneficial properties of whatever they take in.
Yeah, well, my last question is about fasting. Fasting seems to be all the rage right now, and I know a lot of people have issues with fasting, especially when they're so used to eating 24/7, and suddenly, all of a sudden, they're like, "Oh, well, I'm not going to eat for this period of time." Are you a proponent of fasting, first of all, and then also, is this going to help people who might want to fast? Because I know a lot of times when you're fasting, you may have those cravings for different foods.
Right. That's one of the primary reasons that I am extremely conservative about fasting. And, I mean, intermittent fasting is a possibility, but it's, again, something that we have virtually no real long-term research on. We don't know. We have been playing with fasting big time since the 1970s, and it has had such terrible rebound effects. I mean, I can't tell you the number of young women and girls with eating disorders who developed full-on bulimia or anorexia after their first ever fast. So we just don't know. And I don't believe that we have any business advocating a radical diet when we don't know the consequences for sure. I certainly get a lot of variation in response, and we need a solution to our obesity and degenerative disease problem. But I know that healthful food eaten 3 times a day at least supported our health and our weight for 2 million years. So I'm afraid of the consequences. And I'm very happy to see that there are some studies being done on, for example, medically monitored fasts, which are always 400 to 500 calories a day, and seeing terrible long-term hormonal changes affecting metabolism and appetite. But I think the thing that's the most fascinating on this subject that I mentioned in the book is the fasting of animals in order to achieve weight gain at market time. The best research on fasting really has been done on steers. And as a result of it, beef producers all over the world are fasting their animals. After the first 3 months, they have a 3-month period of very limited food, and then they give them the usual amount of food for the last 3 months of their lives, and they gain almost twice as much weight as the cows that are fed the standard amount the whole time. The only difference is that they were fasted. So we just cannot assume that we know for everyone that any new and radical diet is going to be the answer. But with the aminos to help with cravings, it's a safer proposition. But that still doesn't protect us from whatever these are ancient mechanisms we're playing with. You know, another thing I talk about in the Craving Cure is about what we do know from societies that kept really good records in the 17 and 1800s who were, the victims of a terrible famine, and what happened to their offspring. And what happened was weight gain and diabetes. So we're talking long-term repercussions for anything that we do that is not a traditional food pattern. That's, so I'm coming from a very conservative position, wanting us to stick with the traditional foods and eating patterns that our forebears thrived on. And this extensive experience I've had with eating disorders that were clearly triggered by fast.
I think your book made me realize that you need to kind of deal with the cravings first, and then maybe if you want to go into that, then venture into it. But I think you probably want to balance out your neurotransmitters and do all that stuff first before you ever try to do any type of fasting. And I think in our society,
especially if you've done quite a bit before.
Yeah, I think in our society we try to just leap to the
most extreme hope.
Well, the most extreme thing, and then the thing that we think is going to fix our problem the quickest.
Right. Yes, that's it. And it's understandable.
Yeah.
These are horrible problems. This is deformity. This is deadly disease. It's understandable that we're getting desperate, but I wish that these things were 100% safe. It's really a gamble, and we've been losing in all of our gambles since the 1970s.
Yeah. Julia Ross, your book is called The Craving Cure. I know this interview could have probably been 3 hours, but we're going to cut it short. And for those of you out there who are listening to the interview, this is a really, really good book. Julia does a really great job of giving you all the questionnaires and lays it out for you. You don't really have to do anything. And so I really enjoyed the book, and it's available wherever you buy your books, Amazon, wherever you want to buy those books. And your site, Julia, is called thecravingcure.com, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, that's the site for the new book, but all the books have their own websites, the moodcure.com and dietcure.com as well. And actually, they're all centralized on one thing that's called juliarosscures.com.
Okay. Is there anything that you wanted to say before we part?
I did. There is something I'd like to say how much I enjoy your interviews, and that you are the best prepared of any interviewer that I have ever experienced.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I always read the books. So if you have a book, I'm going to read it and I'm going to ask you.
Most people don't, Darren, I promise you.
No, but I always read the books and I'm just naturally inquisitive as well. So I like to know about these things. And I'm learning as well as when I'm interviewing you. I don't know everything. I know people think when I interview people, I know everything. I don't know as much as people think I know, but I'm always learning because I'm always having to read these books and I'm always asking questions. So I thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right.
I hope to get together with you again.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.